Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today for episode 669 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and I'm excited to introduce you to today's guest, Dr. Emily Darling. If you've been enjoying our podcast, listeners, it would be tremendously appreciated if you could share our show with a friend or subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. And today, Emily has some fantastic stories about her adventures in science. So listeners, get ready to meet another one of our outstanding people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Emily Darling. So, Emily, welcome to our show today. How are you?
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here. It's a beautiful summer day here in Toronto. I got to go hang out by one of our Great Lakes today, and it almost felt like I was by the ocean. So it's been a great morning.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Well, I'm a little bit jealous, I won't lie. But we're so excited to have you here with us today, and we're looking forward to learning more about you and your work. But first, let me tell our listeners a little bit about your background right here at the top. So listeners, Emily is Director of Coral Reef Conservation at the Wildlife Conservation Society and an Adjunct Professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto. She received her bachelor's degree in biology from Queen's University and her PhD in Marine Ecology and Conservation from Simon Fraser University. Afterwards, Emily was awarded the David H. Smith Conservation Research Fellowship to conduct postdoctoral research at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Subsequently, she was awarded a Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, or NSERC, Banting Postdoctoral Fellowship to work at the University of Toronto. Emily has been awarded the Early Career Scientist Award from the International Coral Reef Society, as well as the Early Career Award from the Canadian Society for Ecology and Evolution. And Emily, in this conversation, we're excited to get to know you both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
I'd have to say oh gosh, everything. I love being outdoors with people, having fun, having adventures. So I used to be a rock climber for a number of years when I lived closer to mountains or crags. And I just remember having amazing trips with friends to the deserts of Joshua Tree, to these limestone canyons of northern Mexico and El Potrero Chico. Some of my favorites were climbing in the New River Gorge in West Virginia. And you're climbing out of this temperate forest at sunset over a national river wilderness with friends, pushing yourself, learning new things. So I love being outside. When COVID hit, I was here at home. I live on the Toronto Islands, so just outside of Toronto in Ontario in Canada. And I was landlocked, far away from the oceans, far away from coral reefs. And I was really lucky to join a community sailing club and start sailing. Ooh. So lately, I've loved being connected back to the water from where I'm from on these beautiful Great Lakes. I love racing 33-foot CNC keel boats. I'm doing that later this afternoon. And I've even bought a sailboat. So I'm a very new sailor, but apparently an optimist because I've now bought a sailboat and I'll be moving on to it in a few weeks with my first mate, Jayne the puppy. We're having a lot of fun being outside and reconnecting to the water, even if it's a little less salty than the water that I'm used to.
Now, is Jayne the puppy a good sailor?
He is a Portuguese water dog, so his ancestors were very good sailors and crewed on fishing boats in southern Portugal. Jayne is not entirely convinced that his ancestors also used to live on sailboats, but we're working on it, so stay tuned.
Well, that sounds amazing. It sounds like you've got a lot to keep you busy when you're not doing work, and I'd love to talk about your scientific side as well. As we alluded to, it relates to the water. So how do you describe your work to someone who's not familiar with your specific field or maybe not a scientist themselves?
I study how coral reefs are going to survive climate change. That requires a lot of big data sets, underwater field science, and working with other people. So whether that's other scientists, local communities, fishers, governments, policy experts, these are all necessary knowledge and experience that's needed at all these different scales to save coral reefs. So my particular science, I'm really interested in the different types of corals that are on a reef. So I'm trained as a community ecologist, as a field ecologist, So I'm happiest with a scuba tank strapped on my back, underwater with a field team, and we're running transects. We're collecting information on underwater clipboards, and we're really trying to see what is the fingerprint of disturbance or recovery or climate change on different coral reefs. I've been incredibly lucky to work with people around the world, and so see reefs in amazing condition to more degraded condition, and really try to understand what are all these different diverse reasons for that. I'd have to say there's still so much hope for coral reefs. There are still so many beautiful, eccentric, eclectic reefs filled with fish and diverse corals. And I'm really interested in how to keep it that way.
That is fantastic. And Emily, you can just feel the passion coming through as you talk about your work. And I know for some scientists, it doesn't take much to motivate them and excite them because the work that they do is enough. But we love collecting quotes and sayings and things that might help motivate our listeners as well. So do you have a favorite quote or something that really motivates and inspires you that you can share with us today?
This might be a bit of a controversial choice, but my quote is going to be from Madeleine Albright. And that would be, "There is a special place in hell for women who don't help other women." And I think that is motivational to me because I have been helped by so many incredible women from around the world who push, inspire me, bring new perspectives, have shown me new ways of bringing people together and doing this scientific work. So I really try to deeply remember how much I've been gifted in my career by other women and really try to pass that on. How much of the shoulders of giants we're standing on. And I think that's so important because there's still so much work to do to lift up all women in science. And in my field of conservation, particularly opportunities for incredible women from the global south. Last year, I joined my colleague, Gabby Amadia from the World Wildlife Fund on a paper looking at what progress have we made in increasing gender and geographic representation in coral reef science. And the answer is it's limited. It would take over 2 decades for female representation of authorship to reach equality at 50%, and even longer for truly equitable representation of scientists from the global south. So we don't have that kind of time. We need all ideas, we need all ways of knowing, and we need everything on the table. That's why I chose that quote. It's so important to work together and to raise voice to the voiceless.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point. I'm really glad you brought it up. And I think mentors and role models, these people can help inspire more women to go into these fields and to stay in these fields. And it sounds like perhaps you've had some really good mentors and role models along your career path. So do any people really rise to the top of your mind as people who've had a big impact on you?
Absolutely. One of the first people and most important people who jumps to mind is Dr. Nyawira Mutiga. She is a coral reef scientist from Kenya, one of the first trailblazing Western Indian Ocean women in marine science. And I've been fortunate to spend 15 years working with her, learning from her, from when I was a brand new intern showing up in Mombasa, Kenya with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and now as a colleague at WCS. It always struck me how much she was always willing to meet people where they are. So speaking with a fisherman or a woman who's frying fish to sell to feed her family on the beach, or a government official. She's tough. She's in her 60s. She's still hauling dive gear out of canoes, pulling sea urchin spines out of her dive booties, and measuring corals and happiest underwater. She's so much fun. She has the fullest laugh. She loves an African beat on the conference dance floor, or even better, any other dance floor. And she really took the time to teach me my coral identification. So corals are notoriously a little tricky to identify. And so when I was an early graduate student, my very first trip, like where I held an underwater dive slate for the very first time, I brought this 20-pound book with me with all the photos of corals. And she just, every night, she'd look at the photos with me. She'd compare them to the photos we'd taken. She'd say, oh, this is how you're really going to tell Oxypora and Echinophilia apart. And one thing that sticks with me is she always just talks about happy corals on a reef. So really personalizing what we see underwater, and always joking that these were happy corals. They just look happy. And I do this now too. And whenever I do, I always think of her. She also saved my life once on that very first trip. My luggage with my dive gear didn't arrive. So I borrowed these oversized fins. I'm pretty small, so I have really small feet. Like I usually get the kiddie dive fins, like when you rent gear.
Oh.
Anyway, so I didn't have my fins and I borrowed some fins. They were huge. And so I'd strap them on to me with duct tape, like hoping to tape them on. And I hopped in the water for the first dive, like, really ready to show everyone that I was prepared to be here. And I had a steel tank on. So it's a steel dive tank. It's 3 times as heavy as the normal ones. And I hadn't inflated my BCD enough. So anyways, I fell overboard. The tank suddenly drags me down to the bottom. My fins that I'm trying to kick back to the surface totally fall off. And I have no way to get back. And she reached down and grabbed me back to the boat. And so she also saved my life. She's one of my role models and people I just hold really dear and through my career and through my life.
Well, that is an amazing story. And I'm glad this traumatic first dive, this internship didn't scare you away from the profession. But I'd love to talk about where this passion of yours began and how you got into this field and this profession to begin with. So, Emily, can you walk us all the way back to the beginning and tell us where that first spark, that interest in science started for you?
I think my best answer is that it started at a fish market in Indonesia. I was 8 years old. We'd moved there to live for a year. My dad was working at one of the museums. So we had just finished a month of immersion language school in Bahasa, Indonesia. And I was really bad at grammar as an 8-year-old, no patience for it, but got really good at numbers. So I was often allowed to go roam these incredible markets with fruits and vegetables and everything you can imagine. And I was also sent to do the bargaining as a precocious 8-year-old. But I remember coming into the back corners of the market is to where the fish stalls are. And there's just piles of octopus and shimmering squids and blue and yellow and pink fish. And to an 8-year-old, I was just, oh my goodness. And so in Bahasa, I was able to ask, what kind? Why are they here? How did you get them? What do you wish you caught? And the ladies would shoo me off because they had real business to do and just point off into the ocean and say, okay, I got them over there. Go away now. Yeah. And I always remember that being okay, hang on, there's the ocean over there. And then there's this vibrant life in the market. And how does that work? So I think that sparked my interest that fish is really cool and the ocean is where fish come from. And then fast forward a number of years, I was an undergraduate university student at Queen's University. I was lucky enough to take a coral reef field ecology course in Belize. And after these 3 weeks of living pretty rugged, pretty rustic, learning about corals and transects and surveys, I didn't leave. I skipped my flight home to stay on as a research assistant for a group of ragtag graduate students who were living for months on this tiny sand strip at a University of Belize field station. And I just loved it. I just loved that you could apply the science and questions and hypotheses to something so real and also that had oceans and fish on them. So when I graduated Queen's, I was awarded a Women in Science Travel Award. I wanted to study small-scale fisheries on coral reefs. And so I made my way to Kenya in the Wildlife Conservation Society. That's where I met Nyawira and her husband, McClanahan. We're both very dear mentors and colleagues to me now. And it was just taken under their wing and by a wing of Christina Hicks, who's now a professor at Lancaster University, and had just started learning about what happens when fishers come in with their catch and how do they sell that to local markets and how critical women are in that market system and generally overlooked. And then I think Tim needed someone to help him on transects. So he said, all right, you can come out with me as long as you don't mess up. Just come out with me, hold my gear, and maybe I'll teach you how to be useful underwater. So that really sparked being a field biologist underwater. I then went on to do a PhD with Isabel Cote at Simon Fraser University, which was just a totally remarkable experience that started to bring in conservation, ecology, theory, especially communication, this idea that you've got to be able to communicate your science if it's going to have an impact. Because if we fast forward, I joined a postdoc through the David H. Smith Conservation Research Fellowship, which was this incredibly immersive program where you continue to learn about communication and media training and facilitation and leadership and all these soft skills that typically scientists don't have. And it was there where my mind just expanded into all these different types of jobs you could do as a scientist. I think before then, it was a very straight ahead path of, okay, so now you apply for tenure track jobs at a university and you go be a university scientist. And At this time, I was applying for tenure track jobs, and it just didn't feel like in my heart what I wanted to do. I didn't want to tell someone what my 5-year research plan was going to be. I wanted to work with the people who are trying to solve these problems every day and figure out what questions they want to ask. So as part of the Smith Fellowship that really seeks to bring scientists into that space of conservation and management, I pursued a job at the Wildlife Conservation Society, who I was still hanging around with after all these years, and I took it. So I've been there ever since, from an intern 15 years ago, holding Tim Anywhere's gear, to now the director of the Coral Reef Program. I've learned a lot, obviously, and I love that I keep learning in this job. I love that I'm surrounded by incredibly smart and passionate people when we're trying to think about how do we save coral reefs, think about their biodiversity, but of course also so that coral reefs are functioning and resilient and keep providing coastal communities, like all those people I met on the coast of Kenya and people I've met throughout my career. Is that intersection of people and the ocean that I've always been so fascinated by, right from back being an 8-year-old in the fish markets of Indonesia.
Well, I love this story of this early curiosity and kind of how that blossomed and went in these different directions as your career developed. And I really like this point that you brought up, that you were able to learn about communication and communicating your science and a lot of these soft skills that I think are underappreciated and undertaught in the education of a scientist, because I think oftentimes the communication is sort of limited to just the context of writing your research papers, writing grants, and these conference presentations, that you don't get a lot of training in how to really connect with the public and talk to society.
Totally. And that's really what stands out to me from my time with Isabel at Simon Fraser University. She would spend hours with all of her students on what is the first slide of your presentation going to look like? And she would gather all these amazing first slides. I remember there's one she talked about where it's like a big picture of a fish and it has a speech bubble coming out of it saying something like, who am I related to? And it was just something catchy. And the talk went on into evolutionary relationships of something. Mm-hmm. But she would spend hours on what's the hook? How are you going to bring people into your work? If it was a longer talk, I remember she'd always say, okay, at 20 minutes, you need to tell them a story, a joke, a photo, like bring them back into it. And she started recording podcasts with us. So partway through, she was always experimenting with different ways to communicate. So I remember towards the end of my time as a grad student, she started Science in 60 Seconds. And so we would work on a script of any recent papers that her students would publish. We would all work and hone and practice a 60-second summary of the paper. And then we would sit down and record it with her. And she would add some cool underwater scuba bubbles. And so just that idea of communicating is important. It's hard work, but it's work that you can learn. Soft skills are good skills because you can work hard at them and try to get better at them every day. So I'm so grateful to Isabel for that. She's approaching retirement, believe it or not, early retirement. And she just won a really big award for her graduate student mentorship and leadership, I think just this week. And I'm just so excited for her about that because she just had an incredible influence on my career.
Oh, that is phenomenal. And I think, like you said, these lessons are so valuable, so important, particularly for conservation research, but I think for so many other fields as well. Just getting the research out there and improving the public literacy in science, I think is so critical right now. And I know you're working on so many different projects and a lot of really cool stuff. So Emily, if you were to have to choose, if there is one project that you are just the most excited about, what would that be?
I think I'd have to tell you about Mermaid. So Mermaid is a collaboration between WCS, WWF, and Spark Geo, this amazing geospatial developers. And it is our goal to make coral reef data faster and more accessible to the people who use it to make decisions. So thinking back to being a field biologist with that scuba tank on your back, you're using really low tech tools underwater. There's like rubber bands, pencils. Always bring an extra pencil that you stuff in your wetsuit. So if you lose one, you have a second one. So we bring backup pencils. It's not robots or drones or anything fancy. It's low tech. But when we come up to the surface, typically we've got to enter that data into the computer, obviously, to statistics and report it. But traditionally, we've just entered that into Excel. And it's a real pain. So you're typing in every single Latin name. There's typos. It's the end of the day. You're exhausted. You're a little narked from diving. But you've got to have these really precise ways to enter data. And then it takes a while to clean it. And you've got to add other pieces in so you can get these indicators right away that you want to talk about, whether that's the amount of living coral cover on a reef. Maybe that's the amount of how much fish there is on a reef or how many different kinds. So normally that takes a really long time. So we as the coral reef community have been really frustrated with that. And I think particularly in conservation, we want to give this data back right away to the people who can make decisions, whether that's government, local communities, local fishers. They need to know. And it just takes too long otherwise. So a number of years ago, we said, we've got to do this better. So we developed Mermaid, which is a series of web apps and a database that's in the cloud. It works offline in remote field locations. And when you come up with your data dripping off your slate at the end of a dive, you enter your data into Mermaid. And it's just a few keystrokes to bring up those complicated species names. Once you have a species name, it's like, oh, I've saved all these important coefficients that you want to use. And here's your biomass on the fly. Here's your coral cover by the time you finish entering in your 100 points from that transect. So it's really just allowed us to bring data back to the people right away. So I remember one of the trips we did before the pandemic in Fiji or on Ovalau Island, and we were living with the community of No'o Village, and they had been really struck by Cyclone Winston a number of years before we were there, which was the largest cyclone to ever make landfall in the Southern Hemisphere. They lost fishing boats, they lost lives, they lost fresh water. So they were really struggling to recover. And in that recovery, they had opened up some of these coral reefs that they manage. So in Fiji, like many areas in the Pacific, communities own their reefs, they own their resources, and they manage them and have done for millennia. So they opened these reefs up so that the community could eat something. So they survived this cyclone. So we were there a few years later, and the community in the morning, as we were having breakfast, about to go out, they said, do you think we should close these reefs? So we've had them open, we're fishing them, but we've noticed that there's not as many fish. We know there's going to be more cyclones coming. So do you think we should close them? So we said, that's a great question. And we went out to the reef, we did our surveys, we came back, we entered the data into Mermaid. And that night around the kava bowl, we were able to say, you're right. Your coral cover is looking great. It's really recovered from the cyclone, but your fish is lower than some key thresholds. And so it means it's not rebuilding, it's not recovering. You're drawing down your fish bank. So you're right, closing it would bring it back up. And the chiefs of the village decided to close that reef so that it could recover and support them during the next disaster. So that's something that really inspires me about Mermaid, about this way of people have really important questions that they want to ask about their coral reefs and their resources. And our role as scientists can be to answer those, but we've got to find a way of making our answers relevant, of answering questions that people want answered, and doing that really faster. And technology can play a really important role in that, especially if it's technology that's developed with the people who are going to use it. This isn't some multi-million-dollar camera system that needs to fly back to the US or Australia, have the images processed with like Wi-Fi and broadband, and then like brought back to the community. We're just working totally offline, remotely, but getting the answers that we need. So I love Mermaid, and I'm always really happy to talk about coral reef data and how we try to clean it up and get it back to the people who need it.
Absolutely. And it must be so rewarding to be able to have those immediate real world impacts. But I think there's a lot of times where the story doesn't have this happy ending like it did in this case. There are struggles, there are frustrations, and there are some big challenges that you face. And I think in science, we don't hear about those enough. So Emily, do you have a favorite example of a time where you struggled really hard with a problem or you had a major failure? And if so, can you tell us how you worked through it?
Yep. For sure. Where do I start? I think the biggest struggle, the biggest failure that comes to mind is probably shared by many scientists. It's when I was a graduate student. So I was living in Kenya, working with WCS and the Kenya Wildlife Service, who manages the marine parks in Kenya. And we had come up with this project to transplant corals between a marine park and then outside of a marine park. And we really wanted to see how are the fish, there's more fish in a marine park. So how are the fish in the marine park helping these corals grow? Were they eating the algae? So there's less competition for corals. What else was happening here? So it was my first big experiment. And after months of planning, brought all this equipment with me, carried in a giant roll of garden mesh through Kenya Customs. And they're like, what are you doing with this? And I'm like, gardening, no big deal. I showed them my research permits, but timed everything perfectly with the tides. In Kenya, there's a 4-meter tidal range. And so you've got to work when it's low tide, and then you've got to drive to the next site when it's high tide, and you've got to put the corals back out when it's low tide. Like, it's very orchestrated. Anyways, everything died. It was a total disaster. We got these corals, transplanted them, had to leave them in buckets, and you come back to this sickly smell and this rotting flesh of the coral in the buckets. And you're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, little guys. That didn't work. And then we started using that gardening mesh to make little cages for them and keep them out on the reef. So we lost the corals. Like, we had like a giant packet of corals that we like anchored to the bottom, and we came back the next tide and just lost it. Had no idea where they were. We eventually found them. It was not actually as easy to go back to the same spot as you might think it was. Mm-hmm. So finally we get the corals in the car. We're like driving to these tight roads up to Malindi where the marine park is. Our poor little corals are like screeching around in the back seat. And finally we got them there. They were alive. We're trying to transplant them into these experimental plots in the marine park. And attaching corals back to a reef is not the easiest thing you've ever done. So we were making cement by hand. So we'd buy cement powder from the markets in Malindi, mix it with water, and then have these balls of cement. And we try to plunge these cement balls to the reef and plug a coral in. And the whole thing's just disintegrating. Anyways, the experiment was mostly a total failure. We did not find out the answer to how specifically marine parks help corals grow. But I really learned something, which was to figure out what questions we're asking and why. So you always hire local experts and do what they tell you. And so I'd hired a fisherman, a friend named Rogers, to help me with this experiment. And one day, after we've gone through all this failure, we're still trying to figure out, and we're walking through this reef with these big buckets of water. I remember the like metal of the bucket handle just biting through my hands that are just raw by this point. And he says, I haven't wanted to ask you this, Emily, but why are we doing this? And I said, oh, Rogers, that's such a great question. Marine parks are really important and blah, blah, blah fish, blah, blah, blah corals. And he's like, yeah, that's cool. And then he sits there quietly. And I said, well, Rogers, what would you want to know? And he says, you know what I'd really want to know? Is there enough fish for us? He's a fisherman. They've been managing their reefs in Kurawiti. He says, I really want to know if there's enough fish for us. And I want to know if our habitat's good enough to support those fish communities so that we have enough to eat. I was like, that's a much better question than the one we were trying to answer. So I think I learned through that failure and spending time with people and finally coming to the realization that we don't have to come up with our own questions as scientists. We have to ask the right people what they want to know and work with them to answer those questions. And that's what really inspires me as a conservation scientist. So I'm not so much an experimental biologist anymore. It didn't work very well. And that's probably much more why I like working with field data and big data collaborations and working with other field scientists. And I really appreciate the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into collecting this data underwater. So yeah, ask people what they want to know. And those can be the best scientific questions you're ever going to ask.
Absolutely. So were you able to answer the question that Rogers had?
That's a tough question, but certainly started to. Rogers and I switched gears and started a social science project guided by actual social scientists, because whoever says social science is easy has not done it. And we came up with a survey about food security that we asked women in 4 villages in Kenya. 2 were near that marine park and 2 were further away from that marine park, and basically asked the women who are typically in charge of their families and food security and nutrition, asked them if they had enough fish. So instead of trying to be a scientist and go measure fish and fish production, I just asked the people who are living that day to day, do you have enough to eat? Do you have enough fish? And we found that people were, in fact, able to be eating enough fish, both near a marine park, where we expect there's maybe more sustainable populations that spill over nearby, but also further away from the marine park. And actually, one of the biggest predictors of whether people could eat enough fish was if they had enough money to buy food. So that really spoke to me about it's not just about managing marine reserves or fisheries. It's also thinking about this much bigger ecosystem around communities, around people making their decisions every day. Do they have enough money to buy food? So still lots to unpack there, but we certainly tried to answer that question in a different way than we'd been going about it before.
Definitely. And it sounds like this particular project was just full of lessons to learn and important lessons to learn, fortunately, relatively early in your career, which is a good time to learn those tough lessons.
Totally. Yeah. Fail hard, fail fast. You learn so much from failure. And I've certainly had many others along the way. I think, another key is sort of expecting things to go wrong and things not to work out. And instead of being really bummed or taking that hard, is instead just saying, okay, what are we going to learn here? And asking other people, this didn't work. What can I learn? What can we learn together? Do we still want to keep doing this? Do we want to try something else? So it's all a state of mind.
That's right. And I think also just structuring projects so that even if they do fail, you still kind of learn something that can be of value to somebody. I think an important lessons that a lot of grad students don't necessarily think about. And I know you've had so much success over the years. We talked about failure. We don't just want to focus on that. I'd love to talk about some of these big wins that you've had. So do you have a favorite success story, whether it was a big win or even just a small but recent victory that you'd like to share?
Well, I'd love to maybe share a small but recent victory. I just came back from my very first United Nations conference. It was the UN Oceans Conference in Lisbon. So it was a meeting of governments, of NGO, policy experts, of conservation practitioners, of scientists, all really focused on the oceans, how to have better policies so that you can meet these global goals. Maybe it's across climate, biodiversity, sustainable development. So really at that intersection of everything important on our planet. And, I think our little big win was organizing a side event on blue foods and coral reefs. So really for one of the first times, at least at WCS, bringing together this role of coral reef conservation, this biodiversity, these 500 million people around the world who rely on coral reefs, but also with a real blue foods perspective. And so that means thinking about what are people eating from coral reefs and what is the nutrition that's able to be provided by small scale fisheries that are fishing on coral reefs. So again, really at that intersection of fisheries, of fish, of ecosystems, and not trying to pretend that those things are separated because they're so intertwined, especially for coastal communities who live near coral reefs. So we hosted a side event. So we had speakers from funding organizations who are really visionary in thinking about how they want to fund climate, coral reefs, and communities. We had a fisher from Belize speaking about what is conservation meant to his community and their ability to have sustainable fisheries. There was an incredible woman from Kenya who is the vice president of the African Fish Workers and Traders Network and Union of Female Fish Workers, and really hearing about what they need from us as these global organizations. So I loved that. And I'm really passionate about how do you keep bringing together different people with different perspectives, but who all have a stake in this game and who all have a right to be here in the sense of what are we going to do to save the world, to have a better world. So I really love bringing together people on that. And this particular little small win was really thinking about coral reefs and fisheries and nutrition all at the same time.
Oh, that's exciting. I think so important to have the opportunity to get everybody in the same room around the same table and start breaking down these walls and silos to be able to solve these huge problems that the world is facing.
Absolutely. And I think that so much of the time, at least as a student, I thought about conservation as being out there in a boat and being underwater and counting fish. And that's a real part of it. But then really it's about people and what are the decisions that people who live in these communities every day are making in their day-to-day lives. What are decisions that governments are making? And then where are those win-wins for things that are going to benefit biodiversity, like coral reefs or like any ecosystem, with also people and their well-being and their lives? To me, that's what conservation is really about.
That is phenomenal. And I know you're doing so much important work in the area of conservation, and it can eat away a lot of your time. And I know we try to recommend for our listeners to take some time out for yourself, to take a break. And I always recommend reading. I think it's great to read broadly, to learn new things from books. So Emily, do you have a favorite book that you can recommend for our listeners out there, whether it's about science or whether it's more just something for fun?
Well, I'm going to take a risk here and not stick to one book because that's just way too hard. But I love science fiction. I know I get that from my mom. She's an avid science fiction reader. So she gives me all the best books. I've loved the Expanse series by James A. Corey. again, it's like people solving problems against the odds, but like in space. So I love the Expanse books. I love Canadian literature. Miriam Tave's The Flying Troutmans is one of my favorite books. Just sort of this wacky family trying to figure it out. It's just funny. It always makes me laugh. It's just so relatable. And right now I'm reading Emily St. John Mandel, another Canadian author, and her latest book called Sea of Tranquility. And I'm really enjoying that.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we will add these recommendations to our website for our listeners out there to find the Expanse series, The Flying Troutmans, and Sea of Tranquility. I think you're the first to recommend those, so we appreciate those recommendations. And I know we've touched on some different aspects of your career. And one of the things I think that a lot of scientists don't appreciate when they start their scientific careers are all the opportunities that you have to travel, to work with people all over the world, whether it's in conferences, collaborations, or fieldwork. So do you have a favorite place, Emily, that your scientific travels have taken you?
I have been so lucky to work with phenomenal people in just such inspiring places on these inspiring problems. But if I have to choose one, and I will stick to that, unlike for the books, it's got to be a trip to the Solomon Islands, so to Western Province. And I'm really thinking about working with Stacy Jupiter, who's another WCS scientist and our regional director of Melanesia. And being able to be on that trip with her just opened my eyes to such a new context and way of knowing and doing conservation in the Pacific, where there's not even a word for conservation because it is in people's culture to take care of resources and make sure they're there for future generations. And so if you talk about conservation, people are like, I don't understand that word. Of course they do, but they're like, that's not what we're doing here. We're having sustainability for the future. And you're like, oh yeah, like that's the way to do it. That's the way to think about it. Anyway, so I'm really thinking of a trip to the Solomon Islands with Stacy Jupiter. We spent time in the village of Munda, and then we surveyed coral reefs all around the island of Kolombongra, and just remote, tough conditions that were just so stunningly beautiful. Above water, below water, the incredible meals and hospitality that local families gave us for being there. I'm thinking about every morning we would have our coffee watching this cut from the reef that would come into where we were having our coffee, where we were staying, and then turn into the river. And we were watching that cut because there was a crocodile, a saltwater crocodile who you do not want to encounter on a coral reef if you don't have to. And every morning he'd finish his hunting at night on the reef, and he'd come in and you'd see his little eyes, cruise past us while we had coffee. And then we'd be like, okay, reef's open. We can get ready and go now. And I remember particularly it was one sort of cloudier morning. We're having coffee, we're packing up, and we're like, whoa. Like, did anyone see Bob come in? Where's Bob? Has anyone seen the crocodile? Anyways, and then we kind of saw him finally. It was a little late because it was cloudy. Finally saw him cruising, and we're like, okay, like we can go out now. So I think similar to the things I love doing outside of science in terms of spending real time with real people, learning about real places, that trip to the Solomon Islands just really opened my eyes to a different way of doing things and working with incredible people along the way that I'm so thankful for. So big shout out to Stacy Jupiter. I love you.
Well, this sounds like a phenomenal trip. And I love that you named the saltwater crocodile Bob. That brought to my mind a question. Have you ever had some of these unexpected, maybe a little bit scary encounters with wildlife? I mean, being on the reef so frequently.
For sure. I mean, in general, you've got to be pretty unlucky or unprepared to have something really bad happen. So oftentimes we're maybe exaggerating a few stories to make it sound a little more real. But yeah, I've had some scary times. Back in Kenya, I misjudged the tides. And so I'm like bear hugging a big coral for dear life with my feet swept out behind me. And I'm trying not to let go because I'm going to get swept into East Africa's busiest shipping channel. And so I'm just holding on until the rushing water kind of subsides so I can manage to swim to shore. Or I was in Belize on a trip and my colleagues were doing some nighttime sampling. So we're diving at night, which I'd never really done before. It's cool, but someone said I love it. It's pretty eerie, but I was taking photos for them. They were gathering little fin clips of parrotfish, and parrotfish are so cute at night. They sleep. They're actually some of the only fish that sleep like this. They stick their head into the coral. Their little tails are sticking up behind them. You can see them like snoring a little bit. And my colleagues would go and just really gently clipping someone's toenails in the middle of the night, just like take a little fin clip, and they're using that for genetic analyses and population stuff. So I was taking photos and then I was wandering away and I just had this feeling I was all by myself in this dark water. It's kind of shallow. I could see them far away because they had lights and stuff, but all of a sudden I just feel something behind me and I turn around with my flashlight and there's this huge tarpon, like this 6-foot silvery fish just hanging in the water, just staring at me. And then he opens his mouth and they've got these jaws that just totally dislocate and like it opens up like twice the size of my head. And he does like a little gulp, a little burp, and then carries on. I was just like, oh my God, that's the largest fish I've ever seen in my life.
You made a friend.
Made a friend. Yeah. Did not name him. Did not name him Bob. We were just like, it's okay if I don't see you again, but I hope he or she is doing well on the reefs and buoys and hopefully not scaring too many other divers.
That is amazing. It sounds like you've had some great adventures doing your fieldwork. And I think this does sort of go against the stereotypes that people have about what it's like to be a scientist. There's just this perception that everyone's in these clean white coats working by themselves in the laboratory. And I think that is just not the case for so many fields and for so many scientists. So we love trying to break these stereotypes by showing what science is really like and showing this human side of science that I think a lot of people don't get to see, the fun traditions, the amazing times that you have with colleagues. So Emily, do you have an example of one of these human side of science stories that you can share with us today?
I think I'm being drawn back to memories of being a graduate student with Isabel in her lab. And she always had fun. And she always reminded us to have fun. Like we worked really hard and we did really good science, but you also had to have fun. So I ended up spending 2 winters with her, sort of as just like a hired gun. It wasn't my own research, but I was helping out other graduate students on some diving experiments. So we're in the Bahamas. It's January, which sounds really warm, but actually isn't at all. So we had a little tradition of before we got on the boat, we're getting all our things together of having a little dance off. So we throw a few dance moves as we're getting stuff on the boat. But anyways, this one time during the dance off, apparently I forgot to pack my wetsuit. And I'm a total baby in cold water, like despite being a Canadian. And so I had brought this 14 millimeter wetsuit. Like everyone else is in like a 5 mil or like super tough. And I'm like, I am just going to be very cold. Mm-hmm. Anyways, I forgot my wetsuit on the dock. Oh, wow. We're out at the sites. We can't go back. The water is cold. I mean, I'm not that cold, but like I said, I'm a bit of a baby about it. Anyways, I just needed to dive and do these short dives, like maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes, but it was cold. And so I just remember Isabel being like, just do your dance off in the water. You got to stay warm. So I remember diving like in only my bathing suit. Everyone else is in like layers of neoprene. Mm-hmm. I'm just like, do the work and do a dance off and underwater and do the work. The colder days make for good stories, but yeah, you can do a dance off above water and below water. And especially if you forget your wetsuit and it's quite chilly.
I feel like synchronized swimming is something that you should incorporate into the routine of your field group there.
Exactly.
That is phenomenal. I love this story. So do you have any maybe signature underwater dance moves that you think are the best?
I think anything from disco is like pretty reliable. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they make for great photos underwater. So unfortunately, I have not been diving since the pandemic. So my dance moves are a little bit rusty, but it'll be one of the first things I focus on when I'm back underwater. Number 1, safety. Number 2 is dance moves. Yeah.
I love it. Well, hopefully you'll be able to get back out on the water pretty soon for some dives. And I know you're answering some amazing questions with your work. You're really helping people and advancing the conservation work there at WCS. So we know that oftentimes you're not able to do everything you'd like to do because things like funding, staff, technology, a little thing called feasibility may get in your way at times. So if we took away all of the barriers, Emily, that you normally face, that normally hold you back, what is the one research question that you would want to answer most?
Well, one question I think about a lot with remarkable colleagues at WCS and around the world is, going back to that, one of the first ways I talked about my research, which is where are coral reefs going to survive climate change? And we have some really good models from satellite temperature records. So thinking about things, where have corals avoided the worst of climate change and heat stress and bleaching from these satellite records? So we can say, okay, here's a bunch of cool spots around the world, and this could be a really important portfolio of climate resilient reefs. But one thing that holds us back is we don't always have that underwater information for those potential climate refuges. So the temperature looks cooler, but have those reefs been dynamite fished so they're reduced to rubble, or have they been having remarkable recovery from a cyclone? There's just so many questions. So the one research question I want to answer is, what is happening underwater on every coral reef around the world? So what do those coral communities look like? Are they fitting our expectations that, yes, this is a climate refuge? It's cooler, it's avoided the worst impacts of climate change, and it looks like the pages of a National Geographic spread on coral reefs. Those two pieces of information, the temperature and what's actually happening on a reef, would give us a real weight of evidence that this is a coral reef that can make it, that can be this blueprint to recover the rest of the world's reefs as we get our carbon problem in hand any day now. But we also know that there's going to be other ways for coral reefs to survive climate change. So I would also want to use that global data set of coral communities to look at where are reefs that have been hit by climate change, but have coped, have made it through. And we think that you might be able to see that in the signals of their coral communities in terms of there's slower growing, hunker down, big, massive corals as a signal of that. And there might also be places that have been really hit and hammered by climate change, but are recovering. And that is just so crucial to understand why and where and how. And we can see that in the signal of coral communities too, in terms of if there's baby corals recruiting to the reef, recovering, building the next generation. So maybe there's some smaller corals, but there's still a diversity of corals. So I've always loved thinking about coral communities, and they can tell us so much, but we really only have that kind of data for a small fraction of the world's reefs. And if I can wave my magic wand and not have any feasibility to worry about, I would want to know, well, what are the coral communities of every reef around the world?
Oh, well, that is a big and fascinating question. We appreciate you chatting with us about it and giving me and our listeners something to ponder for the rest of our day here. And I know we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of topics in our interview today, but I'd love to end with advice. So, Emily, is there one piece of advice that you received at some point that really helped you that you can pay forward and pass on to our listeners today?
I have been so lucky to work with incredible people who I always learn something from listening to them. One that stands out is, I think, in a minivan somewhere in Indonesia with the ever wise Dr. Helen Fox, who is one of the mentors on my first postdoc project. And I remember her saying, look, it's not a zero-sum game. And I was like, wait, what do you mean by that? And she was like, it's not like one pie where someone else taking a piece of it means that you have less. It's not a zero-sum game. You can work together. You can have collaborations. You can all contribute something, and someone else doing something great is not taking away from what you're doing. And I think about that a lot. It's not about competition. It's not about a zero-sum game where you're losing if someone else is winning. There's so much to be gained from working together, from celebrating other people's successes, from learning from that, from being gracious about your own successes. So best advice that I think about a lot is Dr. Helen Fox saying it is not a zero-sum game.
Well, I think that is excellent advice, both for science and for life in general. So thank you for sharing that with us today, Emily. Wonderful note to end on. If our listeners are curious and they want to learn more about you and the wonderful work you do, what is the best way for them to do so?
So I'm pretty active on Twitter. I think one of the things that rubbed off from being in Isabel's lab was joining Twitter and being a bit of an early science Twitter geek. So feel free to follow me on Twitter. I'm at Emily S. Darling. I have a website, emilysdarling.com, in various stages of upkeep, but that's kind of a fun website. It has a lot of my underwater photos on it. So I've been so lucky to be able to tell stories from the places I've been by taking photos above and below water. So on my website, you can see some of those photos. And I always love underwater photography advice if you've got any. And then I guess on more of the life stuff, feel free to follow me on Instagram at ESDarling, or perhaps more importantly, you can follow at Jayne the puppy on Instagram and learn about his upcoming adventures on our sailboat.
That is amazing. Well, listeners, definitely get connected to both Emily and the puppy on social media. And I will vouch for the underwater photos are breathtaking. So listeners, check out that website as well. And Emily, it's been such a pleasure to hear from you today on the show.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to talk about the science that I'm really passionate about, but how I got here. I think none of us get here on our own. It's such a community lifting us up. And I love learning that about science and scientists, and encourage anyone out there to be a scientist, join conservation. It's a fascinating field. I love what I do. And thank you so much for the time to be able to talk a little bit more about that today.
Well, Emily, we appreciate you sharing your insights, your passion with us. And listeners, it's been wonderful to have you here with us as well. And we look forward to seeing you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.